am thrilled to be joined this morning by Hereditary Chief Stephen Augustine and Senator Dan Christmas.
I mean, living on the land and just listening to the old people talking about our culture or our tradition, like long time ago, they'll talk about something long time ago. It's so long ago we don't even know if it's true.
People were so resourceful that they knew how to use everything that they had to make sure that there was enough. Everyone was comfortable, everyone was warm, everyone was safe, nobody was hungry. I mean, they lived a great life, right? Education got us into this mess, and education will get us out. Art is part of that education.
And I think there's a lot we can all learn by looking at these paintings and realizing, no, you know, it's like they're on the other side of a veil, and it's a continuum.
So the last few years, ever since this center has been brought into being, I say there's a tremendous renaissance of Mi'kmaq visual arts like we've never seen before. It's them reflecting who we are as a people, and they're reflecting the most beautiful part of who we are as Mi'kmaq. And when I see their art, you know, my heart just pounds with pride.
Hello and welcome, Gwe. This is the Friends United International Convention Centre in Unama'ki, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada. Thanks for joining us for our second annual Friends United Reconciliation Talks. I am thrilled to be joined this morning by Hereditary Chief Stephen Augustine and Senator Dan Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. How long have you two known one another?
Well, I'd have to go backwards since about the 87, around there. Around the time the Union of Nova Scotia Indians gathered in Halifax for the recognition of a Treaty Day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's when I first run into Dan.
Yeah, I've bumped into Steve off and on over the years. But the one time, well, actually, there's two occasions. On one time, I had the pleasure of hearing Stephen talk about creation stories. Mm-hmm. And that was really the first time I really got to know Steve, because his telling of the creation stories were so inspiring. I mean, it just sticks with you. And then the second time I got to know Stephen is actually through my son, Peter. And my son Peter used to work with Stephen at what was now then the Museum of Civilization. And of course, Pete would come home and tell me the stuff he's doing and tell me all about Stephen. I got to, by the time he finished his placement there, I said, I got to know Stephen as well. Because he would come home and tell me what they were doing, right? So that's how I got to know Steve.
Well, you're both such accomplished leaders in the Mi'kmaq community, and I'm curious to know what your, how do you think your views match? Have you agreed on many things over the years? Are you on the same page? Or do you find that you come from different perspectives?
We're not competing with each other for space. No, I think we acknowledge each other's expertise in the area that we master it. And I think it's a common friendship that we have, that we know each other. And at times, opportunities rise, and Senator Dan would inform me that there's an opportunity here if you so wish. So we work together quite collaboratively in a lot of the programming and issues with the First Nations and the Mi'kmaq Grand Council and our history, collaborative history, the real history of Mi'kmaq people, like the artifacts that we have here in this place, the baskets the baskets go back many, many years among our people. And I'm sure Dan has grown up seeing his mother living a life that the old people lived. I mean, I think he saw the last end of what his mother's life was like growing up and being there and living on the land and, you know, just surviving. It's a life experience that other Indigenous people have had but not really spoke too much about. And that's an aspect that I know Dan, and I acknowledge him as an Indigenous Mi'kmaq person who knows about our culture and our traditions. And I know that his heart is there, and that he's pulling for us, you know, the necessary rights that we need, I guess, to move forward with our connection and our knowledge of our own art and our own childhoods. An era that children don't know about today.
Can you tell me what your childhoods were like?
Well, as Stephen just mentioned, I was so fortunate. I had a wonderful parents. My mom was originally from Bodladek, Chapel Island, and her parents were very, very well respected. And so, for instance, they used to look after, her mother used to look after the mission in Chapel Island, and that was like her life calling, and she did it throughout her life. My dad was a war veteran, but his father was Chief Ben Christmas, who was a chief for about 50 years in Membertou. And he became very influential throughout his career and his life. He was involved with numerous different big events in Mi'kmaq history. So I had the pleasure from both ends of having really good parents who were deeply involved with their community, with their nation, with its business. And it was hard for me to avoid all of that. So I got absorbed into that kind of world and that kind of activity and that kind of thinking, and my parents were well, I should tell you a little bit. My dad, because of he was injured in the war, he had war injuries. He died early. I think I was about 18 or 19, and I was the oldest of 6. So my mom, at age 40. Became this wonderful super mom and took care of us, and all of us.
How many?
There were 6 of us, and all of us did well in life. We lost one brother along the way, but the rest of us did well. And we all think back to our childhood about what a wonderful mom we had. And to today, she's 87. She's still going strong. But I think our appreciation for her just grew over the years, realizing that as we became parents, we sort of realized what she did for us, what she sacrificed for us. She only went to grade 6 in Indian day school, but when she became a widow, she went to university.
Wow.
And she became a community health representative, which she did for a number of years. So how do you do that? I mean, today I can appreciate raising a family, going to school, working. I don't know how she did it.
I don't know how she did it. That's amazing.
That's amazing, yeah.
And it strikes me you both have such a legacy of leadership in your ancestry.
Probably couldn't avoid it.
Did it come naturally to you because of that, do you think?
You're born into it. You're brought up and raised in an environment that you're going to live a life responsible for others. And your role is to give as much as possible to your family and your extended family and your neighbors and friends, you know, how to be nice, how to be, you know, nice to one another, and to be known that you have a big heart. Like everybody knows Dan and Dan has a big heart, and he has to protect his heart too from going too far out and too far wide. So he's mindful, and he has to. And so I admire his ability to lead into a life.
But I have to go back to my parents, though. I mean, your parents, of course, have a big influence because they model how to be an adult. And growing up, I always saw them helping people, serving them. At times, if somebody needed to get something done, they got it done, right? They provided that leadership and that strength. So, of course, when you grow up in that kind of environment, in that kind of household, you're just sucked into that world, right? You just get drawn into it. And I first noticing myself, you know, I was heavily involved in sports in my younger days, but I would be the one in the sports teams that would try to get things organized, try to get things done, try to get things moving in the right way. It wasn't something I deliberately tried to do. It just sort of happened, right? And then I began noticing in life that as more responsibilities came along, yeah, you would step into that role.
But I find it's moving to hear both of you talk about that, and modeling in particular. But of course, the flip side of that is the number of Indigenous youth in our country who were torn away from having models like that, from their culture, from their heritage, their language. And that is the flip side of the beauty of which you speak, you know, to have had that privilege to have such engaged parents and who were there so strongly for you in molding you. So do you consider yourselves privileged in that way when we know so much now about how so many lost so much?
Well, for instance, another example, neither one of my parents ever went to Indian residential school. And that was rare, right?
I was going to say, and why was that?
Well, I guess my grandfather, my father's side, just didn't want nothing to do with it. And then I guess my grandfather, my mother's side, equally felt the same way. They thought the Indian agents and Indian affairs were crazy. And they were part of the resistance, right? There was a resistance at the time to not go along with what the government wanted you to do. So they were part of that. So that's when I mentioned I was so privileged, I mean, to grow up, to have two parents who avoided, you know, all the trauma of life that so many other Mi'kmaq mothers and fathers went through. I was so shielded from all that, right?
When did that shield end? When did you really start to learn about the trauma of your people?
Well, when I lost my dad when I was 18, that started the trauma. And even today, I still feel it, because once you lose that most important person in your life, and when you're young, it just, it's like a black hole that never stops, right? You just continually feel drained from it. But still, I had a mom that picked up the rest of it, right? And got me through. So I saw my share of things, but again, compared to what other parents have gone through, what other families have gone through, oh, I really am privileged.
I agree with Dan. I grew up in an environment similar to his. I mean, his mother, I mean, she reminds me of my mother so much. And my dad, I mean, I was 27 when he lost his life. He was 52. It was too early. You know,
oh yeah, 52. Yeah.
Somebody, you know, you're looking after, and they're looking after you. I mean, at the same time, and it's kind of like you treat each other as human beings. You know, caring for one another. And then next thing you know, there's a big hole there. They're gone. Yeah, there's an emptiness.
Well, both your fathers, I'm sure, would be and are so proud of what you've accomplished in your lives. They've been counting your honorary doctorates and all the awards and recognition, and supporting you from afar. Do you believe that?
Oh, yes, very much. I'm still spiritually connected to them. Yes.
Dan?
It's hard to put into words. I've had the privilege of being part of two wonderful clans or families. So from my clan, the Christmas clan, there's been immense amount of support, both past and present, and I would imagine into the future. But I still think of what my grandfather did, or what my father did, or what my uncles did. I think about them. And then my wife's clan, and she was the middle child of a family of 9. And so when I married into that clan, you married a whole clan, right? And all through my life, and we were married almost 40 years, they were the other big support system and network, right? And even now, they're still amazing. I mean, I thought after Dozay had left for the spirit world, that clan would, won't be as strong. But no, they're just as strong today as they were from the day I met them. In fact, I had one of my nephews just text me on the way over, and he was trying to figure out what my schedule was like so he can come over and do some Christmas decorating, right? Oh. So they're still there, they still help out, and they're still part of it, So when you have those big families, you can't help but be influenced by them. And yes, you share their pains and their sorrows. Yes, you go through all that. But at the same time, you also share in their joys and their love and their comfort and their encouragement. And when you hit rough spots in life, they just show up, right? They're there. Mm-hmm. So, that's a beautiful way to think about life, that not only is it your ancestors, but it's also your clans and your families, and you end up having so many mothers and so many fathers and so many children and grandchildren. I mean, it just goes on, but that's part of life. And I am so lucky. I think a lot of us are so lucky to have such big families, right? And it really helps make life a joy.
I'm sure that big family has been a comfort to you since losing your wife. And I know that her death rocked the whole community, certainly here at Friends United and all across the nation, I'm sure. Her artwork, her extraordinary artwork, is behind me all along this wall. And how does it make you feel to walk in this room and to see all those pieces that she created?
Whenever I sit in this room, I can still feel her presence, because I've seen each of these pieces being created one at a time over decades of time. And I've seen them hung in my house, and they become part of you. They become part of who I am, because it was from her heart. So when I come to this place, I immediately look around and I see all those pieces, and they almost feel like my children, because these were pieces that were created in my home, and they hung in my home for a long time before they were exhibited. I think there's about 30 some pieces here. So to come here, I can feel her joy, I can feel her spirit, I can feel her creativity, I can feel, she had this wonderful spirit of teaching. She loved teaching. She was great with children, but at the same time, she spent an awful lot of her life learning about Mi'kmaq and Maliseet culture and language and traditions and history. And she was an enormous student. I still have books and books in libraries, and a lot of her papers she had photocopied from different archives and different libraries everywhere. And she studied it, and she really learned a lot. And then what she tried to do, of course, was to take all that written word and translate it into a visual composition that people can see. They can see the stories. They can see the legends, the heroes, those that were not heroes. And she loved telling those stories. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that a lot of her work is about the spirit world. Yes. So, in fact, people used to, there were galleries who refused her art because they said it was too spiritual. And eventually they came around and understood that spirituality is part of being Indigenous in Canada.
Absolutely.
You can't take one from the other. But she never moved away from that. She believed with all her heart that people as a whole, or as in general, if they are going to appreciate Indigenous people, then you have to also understand that they are also very spiritual people, more so than what we see or appreciate. But her in her art, she was able to express that. And so people often get stunned when they see the spirituality and they wonder, where did that come from?
They feel it, I think. I stand in front of her paintings and it makes me emotional.
Yes, and that's what she was trying to get across to people, that this is a big, big part of all of us, not just Indigenous people, but having our spiritual part of our lives, living and active, is an important part. And I think some of her work sort of tries to teach that lesson.
And I think that's such an important lesson today, because our society broadly has such stigma around death. And like, you know, a lot of the disconnection that exists in the world today, life is very disconnected from death. And I think there's a lot we can all learn by looking at these paintings and realizing, no, you know, it's like they're on the other side of a veil, and it's a continuum.
Oh, I mean, I have to comment on that, Steve. I mean, when in a lot of our traditions and teachings, it was always a given that this life was only so much, and that the real life begins after death. And so you would have many stories about our ancestors, and Dozay for the longest time used to illustrate and paint the Milky Way, and she would say, you know, that's where our ancestors are living. This is where they're enjoying their eternity in this beauty, and she would be so amazed, and I could tell she was so taken aback by that. And so, in our perspective, at least in perspective I'm familiar with, there's this understanding, like a common understanding, that when we depart from this life, we're beginning a brand new life, and we're joining our ancestors in the Milky Way and in other parts. But I feel it's the next step of our journey, that this human life is part of that journey, an important part where there's certain things that we have to learn, but the next part is even better, is even greater, and it's even longer. So I think some of that work, this work that Dozay has, is mindful of that next reality, you know, that next spiritual part of our lives that need to be entered into. So I think there's a sense of that when you look at her work, that yes, there is a world that we're looking into as well, that is not just here, it's beyond.
You've given me full chills, which I call truth bumps. And it's almost like she's dancing around us going, yes, share that, share that. It's so important. Do you love, Stephen, the fact that many of, you say Dozay?
Dozay.
Okay, he says Dozay or Dozay?
It's both.
Okay, I've heard it said Dozay, so that's what I had said, but I don't want to.
Dozay.
In Maliseet, it's Dozay because it means little girl.
Okay.
So probably in our language, it's probably said a little different. But
interesting. So when you see the creation story that you tell so beautifully, Stephen, when you see it represented in Dozay's paintings, what feeling do you get?
Well, some of the images remind me of certain aspects of creation, like the sun, or the first one that was created. I mean, there's an image in a painting I see over there of a person standing in front of a light, which looks like the sun. And there's water underneath, or earth or green underneath. So there is an essence of the earth itself, the first person who came into being, and creation itself. So I look at one painting and imagine those things. I mean, so I go on and I see other paintings and I can imagine, what aspect of the creation story these images represent. So I can go through her artwork and tell the creation story and point to which one kind of perspective kind of points to that aspect of the creation story. So it's eerie in a way how she communicated that through him telling us what he understood her to be doing.
Well, I'll tell you, one time I heard Stephen speak. It was in Halifax or Dartmouth, I forget where. And Stephen was recounting the Mi'kmaq creation stories. And one of the stories he was talking about was the creation of Glooscap. And he was telling the story, and at the same time, Dozay was working on that same story, the creation story of how Glooscap was created. He was laying down the mountain and over the seasons, and Dozay had found that through going through historical material, that location was here in Unama'ki. So I remember her telling me, she said, "Dan, we got to go up North Mountain." And we've been there hundreds of times, but we never saw it with the eyes of the creation story. And so we went up there, and when we got to Aspy Bay, at the opposite side of North Mountain, there was Glooscap. I'd never seen him before. I could see his face, I could see his arms, I could see his body, I could see his legs and his feet. It was there all the time. I just never saw it until Dozay had mentioned this story. And she was so taken aback by that. And one of the paintings here is about that creation story. So when Stephen was telling that creation story of Glooscap, I was in the audience. And I wanted to interrupt him and say, "Stephen, I know where that is. I've been there. I've seen it." But what Dozay was trying to do was take what was written, what was verbal, and translate it into visual. And show people that this is real. So the story goes back over centuries, and it's been passed on over many, many times through elders. But there's an actual physical landmark where you can actually go and visit and see Glooscap. And this is what she was trying to get across, that this is real. And she wanted to tell the story that the Mi'kmaq here in Unama'ki, and for her people too, the St. John River people, the Wolastoq, all of these landmarks, you can go see them today. And they're there. And these stories have been there for centuries. And now we're just beginning to have the eyes to see them. So that was her mission in life, was to bring this to life and help others, not just us as Mi'kmaq or Maliseet, but Canadians in general, that when you walk through this land, you can still see Glooscap. You can still see where he had gone, where he had visited, he had done certain things. And she documented all that. And she wrote about it. And then she did that magic, that metamorphosis. She takes all that and out comes this beautiful piece of art, right? So that's her part of the storytelling. The same way Stephen would tell it verbally, or an author would write it down in paper, Dozay would take it by visual art, right?
And you have an oral storytelling history, but you took the words out of my mouth. It's such a beautiful partnership with the way you tell the story, Stephen, to see her images. And I can't help but think, looking at Dozay's art here, what a legacy it is. First of all, what a contribution it was that she did all that research and she cared so much. And that then she had that gift to translate it into images and beautiful images. So, you know, talk to me about the power, the legacy that art provides in terms of keeping your stories alive.
I was just kind of thinking about what Dan was talking about, like growing up with his mother. I know she was a very staunch Catholic person, churchgoer. My mother was the same way. Mm-hmm. Every Sunday I had to go to church with her. And as long as she was alive, I was going to church with her every Sunday. and I know Dan is so faithful to the church in that way that I would be as well as I was with my own mother, and so I'm grateful listening to his story about his life growing up with his mother and his mother's family, and how extended that was and how rooted it is in Mi'kma'ki. So I mean, he's talking about belonging and knowing almost every crevice of Mother Earth here where we are in Mi'kma'ki.
And I guess it should be said, you'd made reference to it. Dozay was not from Mi'kma'ki, right? She was Maliseet, and I wonder, there will be people watching who don't know what Maliseet means. Can you give me an explanation?
Oh, sure. Actually, the proper name that they call themselves is Woolastookgay. Woolastook is the traditional name of the St. John River. So the Maliseet have 6 communities along the St. John River, right from Oromocto, Fredericton, St. Mary's, that's Fredericton, Kingsclear, Woodstock, Tobic, which is Nagutguk, and Madawaska. Edmundston. So those 6 communities are along the St. John River. The Mi'kmaq occupy pretty well the rest of the Maritimes, right? Including the Gaspé, PEI, Nova Scotia, part of Newfoundland, and northern part of New Brunswick. But the Maliseet had this, the St. John River Valley was their traditional territory. But they're river people. Everything is based on the river and all the tributaries that come off it. So although we're living close geographic proximity, they're different. They're distinct. Their language is somewhat similar. I can understand some of it, but it's distinct. Their cultures, traditions are distinct, and so I had the good fortune of having Dozay's sister marry my first cousin, which was Alex Christmas. And Alex lived next to me. So Dozay used to come and visit her sister. And so I got to know Dozay over time. So I remember the first date we went on, I took her to the Cabot Trail. We did a drive around the Cabot Trail. And I didn't know her background as an artist at the time, but she was amazed at how beautiful Unama'ki was. She wasn't used to the ocean. She wasn't used to the mountains, the valleys, and
he won her over with our land.
I was going to say, he knew the strategy.
Well, she used to tease me. She says, yeah, you know why I married you? I said, no. He says, no, it was because of the Cabot Trail.
He knew how to wow a first date. Oh my goodness.
I had no idea, but it worked great for her. So
For both of you.
great for us, yeah. So yeah, she left home and she moved to Namagi, and she lived her life here.
And for me, I mean, was she Mi'kmaq? Was she Wolastoqiyik? For me, she was born there. She will always be from there. But her presence here is represented through her artwork, her relationship with the Mi'kmaq people, her perspective, what she understands of us, and in some way how similar we were of each other's beliefs. And like Dan said, how similar our languages were. You could, if you sat there and just listened to Maliseet all day, you'd begin to understand what they're beginning to talk about. Slowly you start to put together their language and begin to understand what they're talking about. And I think Dan understands and saw that as well, that our languages were related to close to each other.
I think this takes us naturally to the Friends United initiative. When you think about the legacy that Dozay's art leaves, and then you feel and look at all the art that's in this building, what does it mean to you that this is being nurtured?
I think in one sense, I mean, Dozay's art being exhibited here permanently or semi-permanently, it helps to draw other Indigenous artists to this place. I mean, it's a place of creativity. You walk around and you say Dozay's work, I mean, there's imagery that there is there that you might use or could use. I mean, so artists kind of move on and express themselves in the way that they want to express themselves, whatever material they use, whether it's oil paints or temperas or watercolors. I mean, a lot of the artwork here is beautiful. It's all done in that way, and it's come together in a way that is almost beyond our control. People are wanting to come here and want to exhibit and want to experience some time with some of the local artists to have some guidance and some influence in what they're doing.
And it will hopefully be here long after we are gone.
Well, I remember Dozay telling me when she was growing up, there was very few artists, visual artists. It was just a handful. And it was very hard to get recognized. And one of the struggles that maritime artists had was that the artists from Inuit artists and the Ojibwe and the Cree artists, they had a very distinct style, and their style had captured the world. But there was an assumption that was the only Indigenous art. But there is more, right? It's not just Ojibwe, it's not just Cree or Inuit. There's also Mi'kmaq, there's also Maliseet. And what the Friends United Center has done, it's created a space not only for those artists to work and to create, but also to exhibit. And so the last few years, ever since this center has been brought into being, I say there's a tremendous renaissance of Mi'kmaq visual arts like we've never seen before. And I've seen before my eyes artists being created. Sometimes with just a little encouragement, sometimes with a few supplies, and they blossom and they grow, right? And they've become incredible visual artists, not just Mi'kmaq, but Nova Scotians and Canadians.
Loretta Gould, for instance.
Loretta's a perfect example.
She would not have painted if not for Rolf's persistence to say, I think you should paint, I think you should paint. And then when her sewing machine broke down finally...
Leave me alone, I'm still sewing.
Exactly. And then her sewing machine broke down and she was like, all right, I'll try painting.
And we're having more and more young people, and it's predominantly young people, who are taking up the art. And their work is magnificent.
And also making a living with it.
On top of that.
Which is a beautiful extra layer.
Right.
Yeah.
But for me, it's the Renaissance. It's them reflecting who we are as a people. And they're reflecting the most beautiful part of who we are as Mi'kmaq. And when I see their art, you know, my heart just pounds with pride. They said, this is us. This is who we are. This is what... They're showing the most beautiful part of who we are. Mm-hmm. And when we see it, and I see it, I'm sure Stephen does, you know, sometimes I'm brought to tears by some of these young artists and their gifts and their talents, and this place enables them to develop that talent. It takes a while, but once you begin to develop it, I mean, it's amazing.
Cheyenne Gould talked about how her painting is healing, and she feels, you know, it heals intergenerational trauma. And I thought that was so powerful. And I know that it's healing to look at and feel the painting. I'm interested to know, given what you've said, whether you consider what's going on here to be an example of reconciliation. On an individual level, even from Rolf's perspective, one person who decided, I'm going to make a difference.
My former colleague, Marie Sinclair, used to say that, you know, education got us into this mess, and education will get us out. Art is part of that education. And it is not just in schools, it can also be in galleries. It can also in beautiful centers like this. What you're doing is you're teaching Canadians who we are. You're teaching them, yes, part of your culture, maybe part of the history, like Glooscap legends. You're teaching part of our perspective on our worldview on nature, for instance. And once people begin to grasp that and appreciate it and see it, and they come away and say, I never thought of that. I've never known that about Mi'kmaq. That's when reconciliation, that magic begins to happen. People begin to appreciate, begin to see things in a different way. And when that begins to happen, then you're actually opening the door for having two peoples come closer together.
Yes. Stephen, how does that resonate with you?
I've seen it in a lot of ways, I guess, from a personal experience context in trying to educate non-Indigenous peoples about Indigenous cultures. I mean, I know Dan's been at it for a long time. I can probably equate the time he's been at it here in Nova Scotia and me in New Brunswick and maybe Ottawa and then back here, kind of trying to rejoin some of these elements. It's a difficult world. I mean, between here, what's going on the land, and then in Ottawa, what goes on in Ottawa, in the discussions, in the open, in the talks, and then there's private conversations, and then more private ones, and then money gets distributed. I mean, like it's. I mean, we all understand how it works, and we kind of accept seeing these things because our relatives are involved in it. They're benefiting something from it rather than totally being against. And you know, there is a give and a take in either side. So I think that's...
There's been a lot more taking on our side for an awful long time, though.
Indigenous people will grow flexible, I think, and Dan will agree. I mean, our people have experienced discrimination so much, it's become a norm to them. Mm-hmm. I mean, what can you do to complain about it? I mean, what can be done?
But where does the anger live?
I don't know. I think deeper than that.
I ask that because you are both known to be such, diplomatic, reasonable gentlemen. And in fact, Danny Graham, who was here for this round of talks, spoke about touring the province with Senator Dan Christmas, who wasn't a senator at the time, and how he learned so much from you. And one of the things he remarked on was he was astounded by how patient you were with the process and how compassionate. And he said, he was never thumping his fist on the table, which I would have been probably, is what his reaction was. And so that's what I mean, Stephen, you and Barry spoke the other day. Barry Bernard spoke about the long-standing racism and discrimination that you've witnessed in your lives. And I am amazed at how you conduct yourselves so beautifully and with such a soulful approach without just being angry. You can understand why there is such anger in some members of your people.
Yes, but a lot of times they look towards a solution-oriented process where everybody will walk away happy. And so a lot of times it's very non-competitive. I mean, people make decisions on behalf of family, for family, and with family, and sometimes extra family. I mean, you reach across and touch somebody else, and if it can produce goodness for everybody, then I think that's really wonderful that is done. I mean, and I know my friend Dan, he's a miracle worker as well, and he does a lot of work behind the scenes. I mean, not really running out there and bowing every time something happens. So he's very humble, and I really respect a lot of that in Dan. Like he doesn't go running around bowing for things, he might be responsible for, but I mean, he's the way Dan is. That's how Mi'kmaq, I think, reflects what Mi'kmaq people, how they think, and how we move, and how we kind of appear to each other, and how we are kind of admiring one another about our childhood and how we grew up to maybe provide something better for the next world, and how can we help one another reach that at the same time, I mean, kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, the world has so much to learn from you, truly. And of course, our country has learned a lot in the past difficult decade. And many horrific stories were told at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then, of course, the very traumatic evidence that was uncovered when unmarked graves were discovered and children's bodies. So I know that's been hard for many Canadians, because for me, for instance, I find it somewhat shattering to my Canadian identity. It's been something I feel ashamed about and obviously emotional about. Have you had many Canadians approach you and voice that?
I've had individuals, I can think of a few here in Nova Scotia, who were, I think the reality of those unmarked graves from Kamloops, I think for the first time, a lot of Canadians recognized that this was real, that this did happen in Canada. And for some, they stepped out of themselves to do something more. So I recall here in Nova Scotia, there was some individuals who had donated land at the Windhorse Farms to be used for Mi'kmaq. There was another gentleman who was in his 80s. He had his own private foundation. He made his wealth in communications, advertising. And shortly after he had heard about Kamloops, he had called me and asked me, what can I do? And now he's sponsoring a major project, a reconciliation project, actually with the Grand Council, to see how our traditional governance can be strengthened into 2022 and 2023. It's an enormous project. Yeah. Something the government wouldn't fund, and I know the Grand Council wouldn't accept government funding, but here's a private individual who's willing to bring them together from all across the Maritimes to talk about the future of our governance. That one person, plus the group that did Windhorse Farms, are from Nova Scotia. And they were not prodded, or they came off from their own free will, their own goodness, that they wanted to make a difference. And all it takes is one or two individuals to start to make a big difference. And I'm hoping, in the future there'll be others. But I was so surprised over the past year or two, ever since Kamloops, to have these individuals on their own saying, we want to give back, we want to make a difference. And they have.
Yeah, and it is so important. I'm certainly not the first to say it, that reconciliation has to happen on so many levels, from government to organization to community to individuals. When you talk about Windhorse Farms, for those who don't know, I want to add this context. That is the largest stand of old growth Acadian forest in the province. And I don't know why I should say Acadian forest, because it would have been your land, and now it's returned to you. And it's a magic place. There is a great sense of spirituality and energy in amongst those enormous trees. And I encourage anyone to visit it. Stephen, have you had a similar experience of non-Indigenous Canadians approaching you and saying that they have, awoken to this?
There've been a lot of people that have come to me, and sometimes they just apologize on behalf of their culture and their history, and say, I don't know about that. I didn't grow up in that era. I'm so sad to hear my ancestors had done that to your people. That kind of a greeting usually opens up lots of doors to continuous conversation and what you would call reconciliation to an extent of acknowledging current history or history that your ancestors or your grandfathers experienced together, like around the time of the First World War kind of thing. So it's a world that you can create and build upon for energy. Yeah.
Does it encourage you? Does it give you hope for reconciliation in Canada?
Oh yes. I don't know, Dan.
Well, there have been times when I've been enormously discouraged. I remember when our fishermen were assaulted down at the South Shore. That was hard. Just to see the racism and the hate and the violence. And then you have, on the other hand, other individuals. And Stephen's right. They would privately tell you how ashamed they are of how Indigenous people are being treated in Canada. And in our case, sometimes they would come out and say, I can't believe this happened in Nova Scotia. I can't believe people are doing this against you. But then when you have these beautiful things like Windhorse Farms and other individuals who are taking the initiative on their own, they're not being forced or anything. They want to make a difference. You know, I find that those good things far outweigh the bad things. In fact, sometimes I think those good things sort of help us deal with the bad things and sort of cover them over, and you appreciate the good more than the bad. So for reconciliation to happen, we need more of the good in many different ways of life. I know some people can donate land and some people can donate money, but there's others that can do other things to make a difference. And some are artists. I mean, they make a difference too, right? Some are musicians and some are poets. Some are journalists, some are authors. I mean, there's so many walks in life that we can express that goodness. And I'm proud to say that I notice those more lately. And I think we're on the right road. It's going to take us a while, but I think we're on the right road.
Stephen?
I'm as positive as Dan's response about us. I mean, Indigenous people today, Mi'kmaq people, Ulnoog. I mean, I feel we seem to be on the right road, and lots of leadership out there willing to, you know, provide their time, their future to leading a community. I mean, and so it's something that our people recognize in individuals. If you have chosen the right person to lead your community, and so in a lot of ways, I mean, Dan's how he dresses, almost like me.
Follow Stephen's style of wardrobe.
I mean, he's a gentleman. I mean, like earlier you said, we're kind of mild-mannered kind of individuals, no pounding the table kind of approach, I guess, to talking to somebody. So, yeah, I mean, I can identify with Dan's being, like who he is, and how he relates with our world, Mi'kmaq. I mean, I see eye to eye with him. I can't see anything that we don't see equally together in a kind of a similar way. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, that we come together here, friends, united.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, you asked earlier, Nancy, about how I saw Stephen. We have a lot of mutual interests, a lot of business interests, I suppose. But the most important thing has always been our friendship. I mean, that trumps everything else. I mean, I think over the years we've crossed paths enough to recognize that each of us have our own work to do, and we do it. But then, you know, when we meet each other, usually in an airport, you know, it's just the friendship that we enjoy, and being with each other and talking about things. And we don't even have to talk about business. I mean, there was plenty of time for that. But just to be friends. And you're right. That's strange. You know how this place is called Friends United, right? It brings us together here too. Yeah.
Well, the next time you see one another at the airport, you will be greeted by an enormous installation of Loretta Gould's artwork.
That would be very interesting to see.
You will really feel like Friends United there, for sure. Well, you both have, I think, so much to teach the world about leadership. And you mentioned Dozay's heart. I would say that you both have beautiful hearts, and thank you for bringing them into this conversation. And thank you for the work you're doing in our region, in your community, in our region, and in our country, and in our world.
Thank you, Nancy. We really appreciate doing this. This was wonderful.
And here you can see with Dozay's artwork, she had a way of bringing us into her world.
Yes, right, that's beautiful. What was Dozay's heart like?
She loved nature. More than anything else, she had a heart for nature, the created world. She loved everything about it. She loved the trees, she loved the animals, she loved the birds, she loved the plants, especially the healing plants. She had a gift for it. Sometimes we would be driving somewhere, and I don't know how she would do it. You're going 100 kilometers down the highway, and she would pick out this plant going by the road. I got to stop. How did she pick that out? Right? So we got to stop and go pick that plant, or she'll tell me what it is and what it's used for.
She must have been very present.
Oh, she just had a gift. That's all I could describe. The Creator gave her a gift for seeing the created world, and that was her heart. She just, of course, she also had a skill of painting it, but the first love, of course, came from having that love for the created world, and of course that spilled over into art and to other things. But always incredible, I think about it. I just have so many memories of her telling me things about, for instance, I remember one day this bird came right across the road right in front of our windshield. And she immediately said, "That was a red-tailed hawk. That's a good sign." I was just keeping my eye on the road, and how she picked out that red-tailed hawk going, 50 miles an hour. But she had a gift for it, and she shared it, and she taught it, and she wanted others to experience it. But that was her special gift in life.
Boy, I'm sorry I missed her, but I'm sure glad I get to look at the beauty of her paintings. And may I say, here's to Dozay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Nancy.
That seems like the right way to end today.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. What did we miss that you would like to talk about?
I think what aspect impacted me as a child growing up, and I think growing up with my grandfather, living on the land, with him in the Rishabakto Harbor, just living in a place that he just built with floating logs and boards, seaweed, and our fire was always outside, cooking, eating fish, clams, and lobster, and just literally living out there, spearing eel at night and selling them to the fish buyer during the day.
So did it feel like you could have been living hundreds of years before?
At least 100 years before. Living, surviving. But our source of light was a lantern, so naphtha gas. But I've seen it done. My uncle, Abraham Simon, he had a metal basket, and he burnt pitchwood, they call it, or bijuj in Mi'kmaq, which is the root of an old pine tree. Its roots sticking out sort of like towards the ocean, salt water. And you cut those roots, and they're just so full of resin that you just put a light to it, and it will ignite and burn. So that's the kind of wood that they use to burn at night to see the eel in the water. So that's how they were spearing the eel at night.
And can you remember that so vividly?
I can remember it just as if I was there. I was there.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, what beautiful memories to have.
Yeah, living on the land and just listening to the old people talking about our culture or our tradition, like long time ago, they'll talk about something long time ago. It's so long ago we don't even know if it's true. That's how they used to tell those stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you're a story holder now.
Yes, yeah, in a way, yeah.
And you tell them so well.
Thank you so much. I'm sure Dan, can talk a little more about his mother, what kind of stories.
Well, as you were talking, she was telling me one time a story during World War II, and people were still living off the land as late as World War II. And she was telling me one time that her family, and she said she was a little girl, so much so that her father was carrying her on her shoulders. And they grew up in Budladak and Chapel Island, and so they were going by boat to Mulgrave, the other side of Gansu Causeway. And apparently they had just finished planting, so all their vegetables were in the ground, and they needed to do some trading. They need to get some cash to get the stuff that they can't grow, like the flour, the molasses, and the tea. Some of those, they need to raise enough money to buy those for the winter. So what they would do is that her family used to go to Mulgrave, and they used to sell axe handles, they used to sell baskets, and so this one night, they had to travel at night because everything was dark. Because it was blackout because of the war. And she says she remembers going on this boat in St. Peter's, the lights were out, they traveled all the way over to Mulgrave. And they got there at night, and she said they had to climb the hill. She said her dad put her on her shoulder, and they went up, and they stayed with a family, a wigwam that night in a family, with another family. She said next day, her father started to make a wigwam. And he said by the end of the day, her father had built a wigwam, and she said her mother had collected boughs, fir boughs, and she used them to make the floor. It was dirt floor, but she took these fir boughs and they knitted them so tight, she said you couldn't tell. It was like the softest mattress you could ever tell. And so by the time it came time for supper, he said her mother was cooking a pot on the fire, and her father went down to the shore and got some shells, and that was their plates and their spoons. And she said they thought nothing of it. This was so normal, so natural, that almost with basically nothing, they camped in this one spot. And they were there for weeks and weeks, he said, until they made enough money, then they went back home. But that was in my mom's lifetime. That wasn't, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. My mother still remembers that quite clearly. And she remembers how people were so resourceful, that they knew how to use everything that they had to make sure that there was enough. And still today, I'm amazed at that. I'm amazed at their wisdom, at their knowledge, how they could be so resourceful and still have no hardship. Everyone was comfortable, everyone was warm, everyone was safe, nobody was hungry. I mean, they lived a great life, right? Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you do business together sometimes, or your business lives overlap. Is it a challenge to hold on to the traditional in the conventional business world? Do you know what I mean? Can you carry both parts?
I think I feel there's a sense of guilt among Indigenous young people when they enter in the field of business, and that they are taking advantage of other people for their money as profits for their business, and they can't really, they're not comfortable with that aspect of it, like,
oh, that's interesting,
taking advantage of other people by the profits that you make from selling whatever product you're selling.
It doesn't come naturally.
No, I don't.
Yeah, because there's an underlying Mi'kmaq value. One of the 7 sacred teachings is generosity. And sometimes a business person struggles with that, a Mi'kmaq business person or any Indigenous business person, where they individually make a profit and they feel guilty about it, right? But then, you know, when I come across those situations, say, no, sometimes I tell them, no, you can still be generous with your profit. You can invest in other things and other people, and you can give back to the community. And some of the most successful business people I've known are those who do give back, big time. And because of their generosity, they're looked on even with higher regard and esteem than before. And so, of course, it helps their business. So I think the values have to remain the same, maybe applied differently. You have to be more creative sometimes, but there are ways, I think, to be true to your values and still be Mi'kmaq in this modern business world. I think there's still ways to do it. But it's something you have to teach, right? A young person may not know about all that, and you sort of say, well, did you think about this? And maybe you should try it this way. And sometimes the light goes on, right?
Do you feel like you have a lot left to do in terms of teaching and making sure that the next generation is in good shape before you leave?
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, you're on 24/7, right? And whenever your family members or someone in the public bumps into you, you know, you have to be willing to share what you know and understand, and try to help them along, right? So I don't go. I'm sure Stephen doesn't either. We don't go looking for those opportunities, but in life they happen and they come across your path in a day, in the course of a day, and you know. And I think back at the end of my day, I think, oh, geez, I wonder if that person got that, right? I hope they pick it up, and I hope something will happen to make them see it, right? But you can't force it, right? You can't. You can only suggest it, right? It's the best you can do.
Do you feel like you've got a lot left to teach?
I think so. I mean, I think I'm looking at the media that I'm going to be using, that can help me kind of make public my message, I guess. That yes. That it's just like meaningful in a way that you want to understand your own history, your own culture, your own traditions through paintings. I mean, paintings are modern, but the images are old. I mean, as old as creation itself. Mm-hmm. So it's tells us a lot. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you on social media, because I think, and I'm not joking, I think that there is an appetite now, particularly because of the lockdown and how much we learned during the initial stages of the pandemic, that, oh, slowing down is a good thing. You know, there were silver linings, obviously lots of tragedy for some, but there was a big message to the world that your traditions make a lot of sense in terms of honoring the world and protecting our environment.
Yes, I mean, I was involved with this Turtle Lodge. That its foundation is in Manitoba, in Saugeen. It was once called Fort Alexander First Nations Community, but they changed their name back to Ojibwe, Saugeen. And so he gathered a lot of elders together there and formulated a kind of a North American knowledge keepers kind of Turtle Lodge.
It is an interesting challenge. You know, non-Indigenous people too often think about Indigenous people in Canada as being one group, but you are so many different groups and tribes and communities. So there is great challenge in trying to come to consensus when the other side is looking, well, who is representing all of you? Well, what do you mean? Who represents all of us?
Yeah, I mean, there's Indigenous organizations in Canada that purport to represent like status Indians, elected chiefs, So there's organizations that are led by, like the Assembly of First Nations being the National Assembly of all the 632 First Nations communities, the chiefs. I mean, they form this organization that they have a national chief and an executive and a budget and so on and so forth. So there's a system in place. I mean, and it's the elected chief's kind of responsibility to keep trying to influence the minister responsible for Indigenous affairs and so on and so forth. So it's a big role our people have to play, and we all have to exert ourselves, I guess, in a role that we end up in playing. You know, I just recently got an Order of Canada. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't really looking forward to it. I mean, like, I wasn't doing what I'm doing to seek awards or recognition. I just like doing what I like doing. And then I was recognized with an honorary doctorate degree from UNB in New Brunswick, my own
I heard that.
provincial, where my reserve is situated in New Brunswick.
But how did it feel to receive it? I'm curious.
To receive this honorary doctorate from them, I don't know, I was like, I felt good that they recognized me for what I've done and the work I've done, and that I've studied there as well in their university. So anyway, it felt good to receive the award in St. John, New Brunswick, about a month ago. Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful to see the recognition that you've both gotten. I would like to ask about the Pope's visit. First, the apology and the visit. I know that you're still attached to the Catholic Church, according to Stephen's description, anyway. Would you say that's
Well, I really honor and respect my mother's faith, so I try to be respectful as much as I can.
So what was your takeaway? How did you feel at the first of all at the apology and then the visit?
I was very grateful for it. I was saddened that some felt it wasn't enough or more should have been done, but I figured you had to start somewhere, and that somewhere had to be an apology from the Pope himself. That had to be the starting place. Yes, other things can happen, other things will happen, I'm sure, but it had to start there. I was very pleased that the delegation of elders that did go to the Vatican, a very prestigious group of honorable individuals from Canada, and they all accepted it, all accepted the apology, which I think is so important, and I've told others, is that it doesn't do any good to hold on to the harm, to hold on to the bitterness, to hold on to the anger, as justified as it is. It just holds you as a prisoner for the rest of your life and your family and your community. The best thing to begin healing is to accept that apology and let go. And I think that process is starting. I think it's going to be gradual, but those that I've heard from, they sincerely from their heart accepted the apology, and they themselves said it felt like a release. So I think it's a step in the right direction. A lot more has to be done. But this year I'll look back to that and I'll say, you know, if there's one thing that we've accomplished, it was that apology. And I think that was by far the best thing that could have happened.
Thank you again so much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy.